George, are you there?
Hey, yes, John, hi.
How are ya?
Good, good. Starting to get chilly here in Santa Fe.
Yeah, it's a very cold fall day. One of the first classic fall days we've had in a very weird fall.
Yeah, it's been warmer here than usual. We've been getting into the 60s and low 70s sometimes, but freezing at night.
Yeah. Oh, we
yeah,
had.
But now it's nice and crisp, like I like it.
We still had peepers peeping at night just until a couple of weeks ago.
Wow, those are those little frogs?
There's little frogs, and also various insects still making their noises, which normally that stops in mid-September or so.
Wow. Yeah, and here I noticed that the cottonwood trees along the Santa Fe River, a lot of them still have their yellow leaves, and it seems late to me, but I don't know. Maybe there's something to this global warming.
Well, I'll have to ask Andy Repkin the next time I see him.
Yeah, we should get him back.
We should.
He's doing a new blog. Did you see that? It's called, what is it? Earth dot... no, something. Is it something .earth? Or maybe just .earth.
.earth, that sounds right.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
I should have him back on because there's a lot going on in that realm, and we've got this Green Book Award that I created at Stevens, and we've got to come up with a book to give it to for next year.
Oh, what's the deadline?
It's whenever I decide.
Oh, that's good. I'll see what I can come up with.
Okay. We've got a few candidates already.
Yeah.
Anyway, we could talk about that some other time. There's something else that happened at Stevens I wanted to mention quickly before we get to science in the news. I sort of feel like in the new and improved blogging heads, they want us to cover breaking news events instead of just
God, I hope not.
anything that we feel like talking about.
Yeah, I don't know, maybe, but everyone's doing that. But anyway, there's some good science news this week and last. But what happened at Stevens?
Well, so we have this lecture series, and on Wednesday night we had a lecture by a woman named Janet Conant.
Oh, yeah.
Who is, actually she was a classmate of mine at Columbia Journalism School back in 82 and 83.
Oh.
And she's gone on to have a really interesting career. She was at Newsweek for a while as a sci-tech writer, then was at Vanity Fair, and then she wrote a couple of histories of research during World War II, which were inspired by her own recollections of growing up as the granddaughter of James Conant.
Bryant Conant?
Yes, who was the president of Harvard during World War II. And I hadn't realized, I'm sorry to say, I didn't read Conant's books before she came, but during her lecture, she said that her grandfather actually was one of the original creators of the Manhattan Project.
Yeah, I hadn't realized that either.
Yeah, so I guess he and the president of MIT, I forget his name, in the early 40s, they were having such success with this radar lab that had been created for military research at MIT that they decided to create a similar big project with lots of brilliant scientists and lots of money devoted to creating an atomic weapon, which was seen as a real long shot. But you usually hear just the story about Leo Szilard, the Hungarian physicist, urging Einstein to write a letter to Roosevelt, and so they were obviously known as scientists, especially Einstein, but they still needed these politically connected figures to take up their cause, and Conant was probably the most important person to do that. So he was the one that convinced Roosevelt at the time and Congress that this was a worthwhile endeavor, especially because it seemed as though the Germans were doing research themselves.
So you think he really had more influence probably than Einstein, who they may have just dismissed as
a wacky
unified field theorist.
Right.
And, that weird relativity stuff. And,
yeah.
Then you get the president of Harvard, from, I don't know if he was from a Boston Brahmin Society, or
I think
but anyway,
he was
influential.
Yeah, and he was the person who picked Oppenheimer to be the chief science officer of the whole project.
Huh. No, I didn't.
And then Oppenheimer, as you probably know, he was the one who decided to base the laboratory in Los Alamos. So,
Yeah, right.
So Conan was going over all this material, and then it really got interesting and kind of emotionally fraught at the end of her talk, where she discussed the actual bombing of Hiroshima. It was Conant, she said, who actually picked Hiroshima as the primary target or test bed for an atomic attack by the Americans.
Wow.
And afterwards, and in her talk, she defended his decision passionately. So there are some people who have said we didn't need to actually drop the bomb on a populated area. We could have had a demonstration out in the ocean or something like that, and the Japanese would have surrendered. And she said that the Japanese had been fighting so ferociously in Iwo Jima and Okinawa and all these islands that they were defending as they sort of retreated back to their country, that the expectation was that an invasion would be defended ferociously and to the last man possibly, and at cost of many, many Allied casualties.
Yeah.
So she was saying...
So it was supposedly better to vaporize all these innocent Japanese civilians.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I know people make compelling, strong arguments for that, and I've never been able to... I don't know. They don't sway me, but we weren't there then. We don't know. The context was so different. But my God,
what a decision to make.
Yeah, and then to live with it. And
well, she said that he didn't regret that decision, and it was to a great extent his decision.
Yeah.
But he did regret dropping the bomb on Nagasaki. He thought that was unnecessary. I'm not sure how much he publicly, or if he ever publicly protested that. He became, what Conan said that also I hadn't realized was that right after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there was this huge upswelling of support for what had been done, and the scientists were lionized and hailed as heroes. But then after a few weeks, when the international press started writing about what had happened in these cities, and pictures were published of charred babies and people with their skin peeling off, and of course
melted.
Then there was this wave of revulsion even in the United States for what had been done, and Conant was the point man for the administration in defending the decision. So even if he had qualms, and Conan said he was really haunted by the rest of his life by these decisions, he had to defend them. That was sort of his official capacity.
Yeah.
And there was a pretty intense discussion at my school. There were a couple of people in the audience who were bringing up data that they thought, historical data that suggested that we did not have to drop the bomb on populated areas. And Conant was defending her grandfather's decisions very vigorously. So it was,
God, I must have been. Wish I were there. I'm going to read her books now.
You should, well, because especially so she's written 2 books, Tuxedo Park.
Yeah, that was kind of about like some early secret government research lab, right, in Tuxedo Park, New York. That sounds fascinating.
Set up by a financier named Henry Loomis.
Yeah.
So who was sort of a science hobbyist, and then his work, he created a private lab up in Tuxedo Park, and that became the radiation lab, or the radar lab.
Oh, that was the original rad lab.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that.
That became the big lab at MIT. But her next book, it's called 109 Palace.
East Palace.
Yes.
Yeah, that's just a mile from my house.
Well, see, that's why I thought you might find it interesting. It's all about the founding of Los Alamos and
109 East Palace was the Manhattan Project's office in Santa Fe, and it's in this really great block downtown where it's, the whole complex is called Sena Plaza, or I guess I'm not sure if it's part of Sena Plaza or right next to it. It all is kind of a continuous old hacienda-style building, and the scientists, when they arrived, they'd arrive in Lamy on the train, which is the nearest train stop, and then they'd be driven to 109 East Palace and get their papers and their secret identities and things.
And then go trooping off into the this really awful camp up in the mountains in Los Alamos.
Yeah, I guess it was pretty rustic conditions, especially if you weren't one of the top people.
Right.
Yeah, but I love the history is just fascinating. When you go up to Los Alamos, they have two museums. One is more of a science museum, and it's good, but what's really great is an old museum on the history of the Manhattan Project with these old photographs. And, I was looking, 109 East Palace is now something called Honorato Home and Ambiance. Since 1987, the specialty here has been luxury European bedding and bath products.
I guess that's progress.
Between here and 109 East Palace, here being where I live, there's also the Delgado Street Bridge, which was the handoff place for, I guess it was it Klaus Fuchs? And, it was David
spy.
Greenglass.
Oh, there was more than one spy?
Well, of course there were the Rosenbergs and Klaus Fuchs and David, was it Greenglass?
He was the person that Fuchs passed his secrets to?
Oh, God, I don't remember. I should look these things up before.
It's interesting. Another thing that Conan said that was getting people riled up was that, first of all, she thought that this is an important piece of history for everybody to be familiar with, but especially scientists, because we're at war now, not just in Iraq, but there's this war on terror. You know that many scientists are involved in creating technologies that can be used for national security purposes. At my own school, there is a lot of research on encryption and surveillance technologies and all these sorts of information technologies that can be used for national security purposes. And she said that scientists they can't just see themselves as scientists. They have to think through the ethical implications of what they're doing. And she actually said, who are the scientists who are speaking out about how their research is being used by the military now? And nobody could think of any, and I couldn't think of any, but actually since then I've thought of anthropologists who have been enlisted by the Pentagon to give them advice on how to handle tribal rivalries in Afghanistan and Iraq, for example. And actually there are some leading anthropologists who are speaking out against that alliance of anthropology with the military, even though some anthropologists who are doing it have convinced themselves that it's a good thing and it will help people in Iraq and Afghanistan. But there's some others who think that that's just an unholy partnership of science and the military.
Well, it was a huge issue when we were in college with Vietnam and all the DARPA sponsored research.
Right.
Some of which had really tangential applications, like most of the artificial intelligence research was really funded by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, but not, as I understand it, with hopes of having necessarily immediate applications.
Yeah.
Like killer robots and things like this, but more just this very idealized idea of defense, that a very important part of a country's defense is to be doing the best, most cutting-edge science in all different avenues.
So I guess it would include economic strength under national security. So
but then obviously, you get, the closer you get to where you're actually producing something. Well, we got into this when we're talking about the Jasons.
Yeah.
And that,
Well, anyway, Yeah,
wow, that sounds amazing.
We
I was just looking it up just for the record, and Delgado Street Bridge was indeed Klaus Fuchs.
Uh-huh.
And the other spy was David Greenglass, and I'm not sure if he was involved in the bridge incident or not. I'll have to go back and look at Richard Rhodes' great book, The Making of the Atomic Bomb.
Oh, yeah.
That stuff about Conant must be in there. I just had forgotten it.
Yeah, well, it was news to me.
Yeah.
So anyway.
So
back to the front pages of the papers and
the State of the Universe report.
Yeah, breaking science news. So the story that I noticed this week was by Gina Colada, a front page story on cloning monkeys.
Yeah, they clone. So what's the deal? They cloned a monkey cell and used it to get stem cells that were genetically identical to the monkey, obviously.
Yeah, I think they actually created. There was an extra step. They created embryos from skin cells of an adult monkey, and then from those embryos they extracted stem cells.
Sure, because then you could get stem cells for all kinds of different lines.
Yeah, and this has been, everybody was expecting this to happen sooner or later. I think this was a claim that had been made. Actually, it was some South Korean
scientist.
This is
he's the one who said he did it with humans.
Yes, right? Like 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And Huang was his name?
Yeah, God, that was such an embarrassing...
And it turned out that was a fraud, and that had been splashed over the front pages of papers around the world.
Yeah, it was a huge story.
Yeah, and it had originally been published in Science, I think, so peer-reviewed. That was a tremendous embarrassment. But this looks like the real thing, and if it can be done with monkeys, at least according to this story that Gina Colada did, it should be relatively easy to take the next step and do it with humans. And so then
I can't see why it wouldn't just be, why it would be any more difficult, except politically.
Yeah, I thought that it was sort of primates as a class that were considered to be more difficult than, for example,
mice.
Mice or sheep. Remember Dolly the sheep?
Right.
And some other animals. I wasn't really sure why primates were supposed to be so difficult.
Yeah, I'm not sure why either. But once you get one primate, there was this guy Darwin that argued that we're related to these big monkeys and apes and things. So if he's right, this will be huge.
Well, so what do you think? So then, in this story, there was the obligatory quote from the bioethicist who was warning that this could take us down this dark and dangerous path toward
the slippery slope,
cloning humans.
Yeah, Nazi monster scientists will be, creating humans in laboratories, and I don't know. I really find that really hard to worry about. When you think of all the the potential for medical therapies that could come out of stem cell therapy.
Well, what's your attitude about cloning itself, cloning humans? I never really understood what the big deal is.
Yeah.
Why do you think people find it so horrible? And it seems to be, even the scientists, when they're defending cloning and stem cell research and all this sort of stuff, usually just sort of defend the medical benefits, and they say, of course, we're not going to actually clone humans.
Yeah, right. But if they really want to, though.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess it's creepy to think of, coming face to face with someone who had your exact genetic complement. It's sort of like, there's that movie that just came out, a computer animation where they scanned in Angelina Jolie and all these people, so they look almost human-like, and yet there was an interesting blog thing on the New York Times Bits blog about this, and they talked about just kind of this eerie feeling of what it would be like to look at this person, this simulated person who's almost human but not quite human, and it would maybe be similar if you came face to face with your own clone.
Well, what puzzles me about this is that we've always had natural clones, right?
Yeah.
From the beginning of time, we've had identical twins. And so when people say how weird it is that we have genetically identical copies of a human. I would think the identical twins would find that insulting.
Yeah,
Because-
well, the fact is, once the embryo splits into two genetically identical progeny, then within seconds they start diverging along different paths.
Yeah.
So.
Well, so the scenario that I like to pose to people is, let's say you've got a couple who they have a child the old-fashioned way, and then something happens to the child, and the couple is distraught, and they decide that they want to clone it.
Yeah.
What's wrong with that? Why should the state intervene to prohibit them from doing that?
Yeah. No, I don't think they should. I mean, I think it's kind of an odd thing to do, rather than just having another child. But what the hell? Why not? And,
yeah. I mean,
and it'd be very interesting because they'd find that the same combination of genes growing up in basically the same environment, but on a different timeline a little later, is going to become a completely different person.
By the way, I just have to tell you a bizarre incident that happened to me once related to this debate about cloning. I once was at a dinner party with all these bioethicists.
Yeah.
And,
you're right. You're near the hotbed, right?
Yeah.
The
Hastings Institute, and so we were talking about cloning and stem cells and everything, and I posed this question: what's wrong with a couple who's lost their child from cloning it? And their child, let's say the child has been killed, the couple decides to clone it. What's wrong with that? And I posed it to this particular bioethicist who's very prominent, sitting across the table from me, and he was sitting right next to his wife, and they both visibly blanched and were kind of looking down at their plates. And at that moment, I remembered that their daughter had been murdered.
Oh.
And so then so then I was probably blanching myself, and I was trying to figure out what to do next. Fortunately, this ethicist kind of composed himself and said, even in that situation, I think that would be wrong. They would be trying to recreate that child, and that's impossible. He sort of presented the standard argument against cloning. It's saying each individual is separate, and sort of then the argument continued. And I actually apologized to him later for having said this, and he said that he had actually written about it himself. He told me not to worry about it. He had written about it. He'd even testified before Congress and mentioned the death of his daughter, and had explained why he thought that it would be wrong to try to resurrect her through cloning. And I said,
I can see that as a personal decision,
right?
Certainly, obviously.
But why should it be prohibited?
Yeah,
that's what I still said to him, and the usual reasons are, well, that's the parents are imposing this bizarre kind of obsession on the child. It'll be a burden for the child for the rest of his life to know that.
But parents do that all the time.
Yeah, right. Parents have all kinds of obsessions and narcissistic needs that they project.
Why can't you be like your older brother? And, you're youngest, right?
No, I've got a younger brother. So in my case, it was, why can't you be like your younger brother who went to Yale and Harvard Law School? How can I live up to that?
Right, and he's like works in the city of London, is that?
He works in London making gazillions of dollars as an investment banker, but I don't envy him.
He probably doesn't envy you either.
Nah, he doesn't. Actually, now and then I envy him his money, and I think now and then he probably envies the interesting people I get to talk to, like George Johnson and so
There's
on.
nothing better than writing books.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, to me, there's,
You know,
you don't want to let this get out, but I'd almost pay the publisher to let me do it.
Yeah, we better delete that from this dialogue.
Yeah, we don't want them to get any ideas. And well, yeah, so I guess I'm really with you on that. I just don't.
You know, the thing I've tried to figure out what's the sort of core principle at stake when people object to cloning, and it seems to me that there's and reproductive technologies in general. It seems to me that they are, without explicitly saying it, usually sort of enshrining the randomness of reproduction as something sacred. So cloning obviously takes all the randomness out of reproduction. You know exactly what you're going to get. And,
except it really doesn't, because that, that puts just much more. It grants more power to the genome than it really has. Since
that's true. It at least takes some of the genetic randomness out of the equation.
The genetic randomness, yeah, but then the way two identical genomes unfold could just be astonishing. And then once the brain develops, it's I wrote something about this once. I'll have to try to dredge it up, but I remember making the point that when you go on a trip, a vacation, say with your spouse or anyone, and you go to do all the same events together, see all the same things, and you come back, and it's like you've been on two different trips completely, because you focused on one thing, she focused on another, and that made you cause a certain connection to spark in your synapses, and even with two identical twins, from the moment they start taking in information and exploring their worlds, they develop completely different minds, and it's the mind that's the person and not the body.
Yeah, experience is what makes each of us absolutely unique. But I think there's nothing wrong. What puzzles me about this emphasis on, and I'm sort of assuming that this is one of people's objections, this emphasis on there being something sacred about the randomness of reproduction, is that, in a way, the whole history of human reproduction is all about trying to reduce the randomness. So marriage and courtship are about trying to find the right mate to create more fit offspring. I mean, that occurs throughout the animal kingdom. I think you can see marriage and courtship as sort of in that same evolutionary strand. And if you really want to be as random as possible about how you reproduce, then what we should all be doing is having drunken one-night stands. So
really mix up that gene pool.
Yeah, which I assume is not what the people who are objecting to cloning have in mind.
No, but they're not really worshiping the randomness. I mean, they don't. I mean, if you're really deeply religious, you don't really believe in randomness. Everything happens for a divine purpose. So I can see if you were very, very deeply religious, that you would object to this, because it's up to God to basically spin the spinner and come up with the genome that your baby's going to have from the combination of its two parents. So it's taking God out of the equation. So I can see why a very religious person would object, but where does the revulsion come from elsewhere? Bob and I had a conversation a few weeks ago, and we were talking about that guy, is it Haidt? Jonathan Haidt, who does the studies on morality, and he has this questionnaire up on a website, and he's done the speculation of what the evolutionary basis are for morality, and specifically in some cases for different kinds of disgust. Like why you would find putrid, rotting flesh to be disgusting, for example. There's good evolutionary ways to explain that, and the same with incest. But why cloning? Yeah,
it's puzzling. I'm just a libertarian on most of these issues. So I'm actually a skeptic about some of the goals of transhumanism, some of the things they talk about. But in terms of the ethics, I say let 1,000 flowers bloom. What the hell? Let's give it a shot. And to get to another story in the news, I'm sure you noticed. I don't know if you're a sports fan the way I am, but so I actually even listen to a sports radio show out here a lot, WFAN. But the big story now, and it's on the front page of the New York Times, is that Barry Bonds, the baseball player, was finally indicted for lying to a grand jury about his use of steroids.
Yeah.
So he went before this grand jury years ago now, I think, and said that he had never knowingly done steroids. And now there's this federal indictment against him that says that there's lots of evidence that he has been doing steroids for years. And with steroids, I feel like, what the hell? Let them take steroids.
Yeah.
These people are already freaks of nature. Let them. If steroids were completely legal, these athletes would figure out how to use them relatively safely. That's my assumption.
And you level out the playing field.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, wow, a metaphor that's not a metaphor.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, again, it'd be nice to have a spirited debate about this, but it's never bothered me either. I mean, should you maybe take away somebody's PhD in theoretical physics because you find out that he was taking amphetamines and staying up all night studying?
Thank you. We give our students Ritalin and Adderall by the
Right.
bucket load now.
Now that bothers me.
Right. Well, yeah. But I mean, it's just the hypocrisy is so ridiculous. So I mean, and alcohol is legal. Alcohol has killed exponentially and damaged exponentially more people, ruined more lives than steroids ever will. So it just
right.
it's really silly to me. So the plain
and it can be a dumb decision because the negative health effects of steroids over time. But again, I'm not sure you can control that. But I can see regulating it because of the harm it would do to the individual, and I think sometimes the state does have a role in protecting people against themselves. But if the issue is that the person's athletic performance is counterfeit if they're taking these steroids, then I don't find that a very compelling argument.
No, I mean, enhancement there has been going on in so many different ways for so long that it just seems silly to try to draw this particular line. So,
well, it'd be like condemning someone for taking serotonin reuptake inhibitors to combat their depression.
Right.
But on the other hand, if it came out that a politician was doing that, it would be a big issue for some people. And it shouldn't be. It's ridiculous.
Or taking beta blockers when they have to perform in public.
Exactly. Yeah, if the violinist doing the Bach partitas does this wonderful performance, and you find out that she took a beta blocker before that to help slow down her pulse rate and her, ameliorate stage fright, so what?
Yeah,
so it seems like the same thing.
And again, there are so many cases where these things are not only allowed but even encouraged. These enhancements for supposedly therapeutic purposes that, of course, just shade into augmentation.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's a funny puritanical, sort of narrow puritanical view we have of this one particular area of sports, but I don't think the libertarian argument is going to go anywhere. But
because just the general puritanical streak of society.
Yeah, I don't see a lot of people making this argument in the sports pages or on sports radio or anything like that. Most people are shocked that these athletes are taking these substances.
Yeah.
They were taking amphetamines going back to the 50s in baseball.
Yeah.
So
I don't know. I don't watch baseball, but
I'm hooked. It's one of my many little irrational
Huh.
obsessions.
Yeah, so have they had the World Series yet? No, I mean...
that's
I don't
great,
know.
George. That's great.
No, that's the big baseball thing, right?
Yeah, the Mets won.
The Mets. Yeah, okay, that's the New York Mets.
No, I'm just kidding. It was the Boston Red
Oh.
Sox. The Mets,
Wait, who won?
it's the Boston Red Sox. Won.
Boston Red Sox.
You know, the perennial losers are now the big winners.
Okay, so they go to the Super Bowl then, right? In January.
Oh, come on. Now you're just pulling my leg.
Sorry.
Then they go to the World Cup, I think it's called.
Okay.
Anyway, so should we go back to science?
You know, there was a really good story by Carl Zimmer, a fellow blogging head,
Yeah,
on swarming.
right.
And that really brought back memories. You know, I think the first person to write about swarming, at least in the New York Times, was James Glick back in the 80s. And, he was gathering information for what would become his book, Chaos.
Mm-hmm.
And swarming is just fascinating. You want to talk about that a little?
Well, I've got to admit, I thought that article, let's see, where is it? It really reminded me of all the hype coming out of the fields of first chaos in the 80s with the publication of Glick's wonderful book called Chaos. And then,
You just said hype, and then you said wonderful book.
It is. Well, I don't think those are mutually exclusive.
Okay, yeah, and I
terms.
don't, but a lot of it isn't hype. I mean, and I think Carl's article was a really good example of how, what an important tool computer simulation can be in science.
It is, except, it just reminded me of why I got so fed up with coverage of these fields. So, you had chaos in the 80s. It really started sort of in the late 70s with work by, among others, Benoit Mandelbrot, the mathematician who created these discovered these mathematical structures called...
The Mandelbrot set.
Yeah, the Mandelbrot set was one of a class of structures called fractals, these mathematical objects with fractional dimensions. And the basic idea of it was that you can have fairly simple formulas or algorithms that, when run on a computer, could produce wildly complex effects.
Yeah, like cellular automata. It's really cool.
So the hope was that with these sort of new fancy mathematical techniques, there are lots of names for them: fractals, nonlinear dynamics, non-equilibrium dynamics, plus
it's
computers.
Basically recursion.
Pardon me? Yeah.
Yeah. It's not really fancy mathematical techniques. It's really simple mathematical techniques. But suddenly you had the computer power to do rapidly do all these little cycles and show how complexity emerges from these simple interactions.
Right. So the hope was that this combination of this mathematics with computers and increasingly powerful computers would help us solve phenomena that had resisted conventional reductionist scientific analysis in the past.
Yeah. You don't think that's happening?
No.
Well, Carl's story gave a very good example of trying to understand the swarming of ants, and you come up with some simple little rules that you sort of intuit from watching ants and studying them and reading E.O. Wilson's books, and then you come up with these simple rules, like if one ant sees this ant do that, it will react in this way, just like two little cells in a cellular automata, like the game of life.
Right.
And then they run these simulations, and they tweak them until they get their simulated ants to act like the real ants, and then they can hypothesize and say, well, maybe this is something that's happening when these ants are exchanging their pheromone chemical signals, and they can go back and test the hypothesis on real ants. So
and in
you
this
get this
way,
engine that drives you toward understanding you wouldn't have otherwise.
Well, yeah, and it was amazing that the language that Carl used, and he's a wonderful writer. I'm a big fan of his, and this was a wonderful story. It had a great illustration on the front of a school of fish in this circular pattern, and then he has
a great picture of the starlings too.
Yeah, and then he's got these, the computer simulations. It's just the kind of thing that we were doing. I mean, I certainly did stories like this back in the 90s, and Glick was doing back in the 80s. I know you've written about this sort of thing, but I feel like Carl is sort of rediscovering this research, and the question is whether there's been any real progress. And if you just
I think it's incremental progress. It's really just become a technique that's used quite widely in science. So in a way, that's kind of speaks to its credit that it's become absorbed as a tool.
I guess the question I have, it seems to me that with let's say particle physics, the physicists are discovering mathematical rules that they claim to be a unique and therefore true solution to certain complex phenomena that they're looking at. When you get to the behavior of more complex systems, swarming fish, that's child's play. Ultimately, complex systems, the ones that we're really interested in, are our own complex systems. Societies, economies, all the ways that we interact with each other, or even the human mind. That's obviously an incredibly complex system with lots of different variables and parts to it. So the question is, when it comes to these sorts of systems, which are called either chaotic or complex or emergent or whatever, whatever you like, there are all sorts of terms for them. Is there a set of unique rules that can describe these systems and therefore can justifiably be called true? I think there isn't a unique set of rules, and that one sort of characteristic of these systems is that you can describe them in an almost infinite number of ways, especially if you have powerful computers to run the simulations. So you
think you could come up with, say, an infinite number of different sets of rules of ant interaction, and then run it as a simulation and get something that looks like real ant behavior?
Yeah, maybe with ants they're simple enough. Who knows? Maybe they could come up with rules that then scientists could find a physical, biological basis for those.
But why don't
rules.
You think this is true then for any rules, like the laws of physics? Like, forget about superstring theory, but go back to the Standard Model, describing the four forces of nature. Do you think that there's like an infinite number of different physical rules that you could come up with that would describe particle behavior just as well, and that we just happen to alight on this one?
See, this is where you and I differ, I think. One of the
I sort of think that sometimes.
One of the really profound.
But I didn't think you did.
No, I think you've actually said this, or you certainly strongly implied it in Fire in the Mind, that there probably are an infinite number of descriptions for anything we're looking at, or mathematical rules, or whatever you want to call them. Yeah. All I can say is just historically, it seems that in physics and certain kinds of science, scientists converge on one particular set of rules that happen to be so powerful that everything else falls away. Yeah. So, quantum mechanics and relativity are two really striking examples that have just been so extraordinarily successful that we don't just say, well, they work well, so let's use them.
No, there's obviously something there. I don't
call them true.
Some days I believe there may be an infinite number of different ways you could carve up physics with different mathematics and things, but I'm not sure how important an insight that is. But yeah, something works so powerfully that it becomes ingrained, and at least as far as the human brain and its interaction with reality, something like quantum mechanics is, quite powerful and impressive. But so, why don't you think that's true of having these synergistic kind of rules?
Well, I think it's just, again, you look look at these fields historically, and they kind of go lurching from one model to the next. Forget about swarming fish or ants for a second, and just look at human social models. So when we were out in Santa Fe in the early 90s, we saw those guys. Epstein.
Oh, yeah, I remember Josh Epstein.
Josh Epstein.
He just bugged the hell out of you for some reason.
He was a great guy, but it was just, his model was just so silly. So he had these artificial societies. He had rules that, when carried out by a computer, created what he thought vaguely resembled the evolution of sort of primitive social organizations. And I guess he's moved on to more complex social phenomena now. But
I think he has a new book out.
But to me, it was so clear that, you get this kind of vague resemblance, and that can just be coincidence. And it would seem to me that there are almost certainly lots of other rule sets or algorithms, whatever you want to call them, could generate similar or even more compelling results. The distinction I think you can make here is where do you cross the line from science to engineering? So science is about uncovering truth, right? Relationships, or let's say mathematical models that actually have some basis in reality. Engineers don't talk about truth. That's a completely useless term.
No, that's an interesting point, because computer simulations, there's always the question of to what extent you're simulating reality and to what extent you're authoring a cool new video game.
Right.
Yeah.
Which came up a lot at the Santa Fe Institute. That was something that they worried about internally themselves.
Well, yeah, Joe Traub, my friend here in Santa Fe, who's a mathematician at Columbia.
Yeah.
And he's written a lot about that. Just the interaction between computer simulation and experiment and theory, and it's sometimes seen as the third angle of a triangle of scientific discovery.
Yeah.
It definitely brings up some really interesting philosophical issues, like you create artificial life, quote unquote, and in a computer simulation, and if it actually got to the part where it seemed to behave like little unicellular organisms in a petri dish, at what point can you say that it's alive or that it's just a cartoon of life?
At no point.
Yeah, I know you think that, but I'm not so sure.
You can pull the plug and it's gone.
Yeah, well, yeah. This could lead us into another discussion of whether the universe is a big computer simulation, but we should avoid that just out of courtesy to our listeners.
Yeah, you and Bob, and you and I, and you and Bob, and Bob and I, and David Chalmers and I have patched that over pretty well.
Yeah, enough is enough.
I guess it's to me.
I see what you're saying.
It seems that we're bumping up against with these complex systems, and one of my objections, if these people said we're just trying to create models that are a little bit more predictive than the ones we used to have, and can help us get a grip on what's out there and all that sort of stuff, that's fine. But that some of them, especially at the Santa Fe Institute back in the 90s in their heyday, were making these really grand claims, finding new principles of self-organization.
Yeah, well, not grand claims, but grand hopes. And,
yeah.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
I mean, like Stuart Kauffman, talking about the possible need to find a fourth law of thermodynamics that would explain how order arises in the universe, other than, there's already perfectly good thermodynamical explanations for how you get energy coming into a system and you can get temporary eddies of organization. But that's what was so exciting about it. I mean, it was people just talking, right there on the cutting edge of what it's possible to know. And, if they haven't, didn't lead to a scientific revolution yet, and maybe never, it's still just very exciting intellectually.
The edge of chaos.
Yeah, well, there's still some interesting stuff going on with that. And
do you think it will ever? It's so interesting that in some cases you're pretty hard to impress, and in other cases, you get very enthusiastic.
Yeah.
And
well, just the deep mysteries, it's just wonderful to, I think it's wonderful that grown men and women are, paid reasonably good salaries to do this stuff.
Yeah.
It's exciting.
And where will it all go? Well, it does keep reemerging. And so, just over the last few years, you've had so we had chaos in the 80s, complexity in the 90s.
And before that, you had cybernetics.
These kind of meta theories. I mean, particle physics, they talk about a theory of everything. That's a theory of nothing. These are true potential theories of everything, theories of the things that we care about, theories of ourselves, theories of how we interact with each other, theories of history, potentially, theories that can help you make a killing on the stock market. And it keeps getting sort of revived, this hope. So you had Steve Wolfram with his book, A New Kind of Science, and he was saying that, that he had discovered
a great book.
These cellular automata that were going to solve every secret of the universe, and then
what he was proposing, basically tearing up physics and reconstructing it from the bottom on a digital kind of basis with, and it's a really exciting, very intelligent book. So I don't know, why does it bother you that someone would be making this?
It's a book. It's a book written by. I mean, at some point, Wolfram became almost an autodidact because.
Wolfram. I mean, there's all kind. I got a lot of grief from some of my friends at the Santa Fe Institute after I reviewed Wolfram's book for the New York Times Book Review, and I reviewed it rather, positively because I thought it was a very exciting book. While at the same time. I couldn't resist putting in some little digs because the guy's an egomaniac. But
I remember I interviewed him years before the book came out, when it had just been sort of rumored that he was working on this magnum opus. And he was, this was for the article I did on the Santa Fe Institute in the mid-'90s when I was still at Scientific American. And I talked to Wolfram, who had been sort of associated with some of those people.
Yeah.
And he was kind of putting them down, and he's talking about,
he really burned his bridges.
Too much hype, and boy, they're making all these grand claims. And he said, but he was working on this way of addressing complexity that really was going to be a tremendous breakthrough. And so he's telling me a little bit about that, and he said, I can't tell you too much right now, but and I don't want to make any big claims. But it'll be sort of on the level of Newton's invention of the calculus.
Yeah. No, I think he still thinks that, and but a lot of great scientists are egomaniacs.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
And then
I know a lot of people that really dislike Wolfram for some very specific reasons, but I'm just judging him on the book and just the ambition of the quest.
Yeah, but at some point, I guess you ask scientists to start showing some signs of progress through these grand goals. I mean, I'm turned on by grand goals too, but
it depends on what you mean by progress. I mean, Wolfram had his company. For people who don't know, he invented the program Mathematica, which is used throughout the sciences, and made a huge amount of money, and then became a self-employed theorist of everything. It's great, great life if you can pull it off. But he had offered a reward for someone who could prove that, a very basic cellular automata, and a cellular automata, to back up a few steps, is basically a grid of squares is one way to think about it, and they're either black or white, and you have little rules like if the two squares over here flip from black to white, then you flip the other way, and you try out these different little rules. And
they're invented by John von Neumann, right?
I think von Neumann, he's certainly one of the first to write about them. And then the Game of Life came out of that, and then Wolfram was trying to prove, he's trying to find the simplest cellular automaton that you could, the simplest little set of rules and that would have universal Turing computation, so that it would have the power to simulate anything that a Turing machine, which is basically the paradigm of a modern digital computer with an arbitrarily, amount of memory to use as a scratch pad, can simulate. So he had speculated that there was this particularly simple cellular automata that had universal computational powers, and then he offered a reward for somebody who could prove that that was true. And I got an email just the other week from one of Wolfram's people saying that a student had proved that this was true. So so I think he would count that as progress.
I guess the discovery that I keep coming back to, and it's this kind of paradoxical aspect of this whole field, is the butterfly effect. So everybody knows what that is.
The butterfly flaps its wings in
so
Garrison, New York, and it causes a tornado in New Mexico.
Yeah, so it was discovered by Edward Lorenz, this meteorologist at MIT, I think in the 1960s. Yeah. And the basic idea is that there's a certain class of systems, and it's really lots of systems. It's all the sorts of things that we've been talking about here, certainly economies and social systems, where you have knowledge of the initial conditions of the system, and then you want to predict its behavior over a given course of time. You have to know the initial conditions of the system exactly, precisely, to be able to predict its course. And of course, you can't know them precisely. So a minute difference in the initial conditions leads to a gigantic change down the road very quickly. And that's the nature of a chaotic system. So obviously that's a limit of prediction, but it's also a limit of explanation, because it means if you're starting with a given state of a system and you're trying to trace it back to figure out what its causes are, you can't do that either, because there can be an infinite number of possible initial conditions that could have led to that system. So it seems to me that this is one of the most important findings of this whole field, and it's a finding that really undermines a lot of these hopes that people in the field have.
Why?
Maybe not.
I mean, but you look through the other side of the telescope, and basically you found this way to explain how, from some very simple little the tweak in the initial conditions, you can get this fathomless complexity arising from that, and that's a very deep, important insight, I think.
Yeah.
And you can also find out classes of there may be probably not an infinite number, but a certain class, a large class of different initial conditions that can lead to the same outcomes or outcomes of generally the same shapes. And then you come up with what they call, I think, equivalence classes, and you try to categorize and taxonomize all these different kinds of complexity, and that's science.
And the models will always be chasing after reality. They will never catch up.
Yeah, unless that's what reality is. I mean, the fact that you could have a simple little cellular automata, a few little rules that you could write down on a piece of paper for how, local interactions cause these little cells to flip and change, and prove that this has universal computational power. And what that means is that little system, given enough time, has the computational power to simulate any physical process in the universe, anything that can be precisely algorithmically described. And that's just a mind-blowing concept.
But can it make you rich by playing the stock market? That's the big question.
I don't know. I know a few people who've... we talked about this before, the prediction company.
That's right.
It's been going now for... God, I first interviewed Doan Farmer and Norman Packard back in... must have been 1992, and the prediction company's... it's just been growing and growing.
Yeah. Well, so is the stock market for overall. But anyway, hey George.
Well, it did well even when it was going the other way. But anyway, at least there's something we don't agree about.
Yeah, that's a good thing.
How long have we been talking?
Yeah. So you, we're almost up to an hour. You got another experiment.
I got an
for us,
experiment
right?
to do. Yeah, I have another little item to pull from my cabinet of curiosities, and so this will be like a science lesson. We'll get back to basics here.
Okay.
After all that esoteric.
Is this going to be? Just warn me. Is this going to be messing up my?
It might. Last time we produced about 75,000 volts with my Wimshurst machine. And this time we're going to go up another order of magnitude.
Wow.
Using something called a Ruhmkorff induction coil.
Well, I'll just listen this time. I won't worry if I can't hear you.
Don't worry if we get cut off.
Yeah.
It makes good entertainment. But do you know what an induction coil is, John?
No.
Okay.
I'm not a real science journalist.
Okay, I'm going to hold one up here, and this is one that's probably from around 1900, and I'll describe it to you. It's on a nice mahogany base, and there's this black coil and all these nice little brass fittings and these two little needle-like electrodes on top. And the idea is, if you wrap a bunch of turns of wire around an iron nail and hook it up to a battery, it becomes a magnet, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. And do you know how you make an electrical relay where you take an electromagnet like that, and every time you energize the coil, it pulls a switch up and down?
Ah, okay.
So that's called a relay.
Yeah, all right.
Okay, and the reason you have a relay is, like, imagine you have some kind of big electric arc blast furnace or something in which you need to, provide it with 1,000,000 volts with thousands of amperes, and you don't really want to put your hand on this switch, so you basically have a relay, and you use maybe a little 6-volt battery to energize a magnet and then pull the switch down and then turn on the juice in this completely different circuit.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so that's what a relay is. So now the concept is you hook up the relay so that the circuit that it's controlling is the circuit that energizes the coil. So you get this strange loop.
Uh-huh.
So basically, like you have the relay, and when it's in its resting position, the switch is closed and the electricity goes through and energizes the coil. It pulls open the switch, and then the magnetic field collapses because it's not getting any power, so the switch springs back up and closes again and then energizes the coil, and then you get this loop where it starts vibrating, turning itself on and off.
Aha. Sounds
dramatic.
dramatic.
So that's the first thing. That's the first thing that this does. Okay, now we just have one more concept, which is induction, which is from Faraday, right? So, like if you have an iron ring and around the left side you wind 10 windings of a wire, and then you do 10,000 around the other side. So now every time you do a pulse of, say, 6 volts on the primary, the small coil, it will induce 1,000 times that voltage in the secondary. So you go from 6 to 6,000 volts. Mm-hmm. So now this little device, the Ruhmkorff coil, basically hooks this all up together. So it's one of these coils that keeps turning itself on and off hundreds of times a minute, and it's used to induce a voltage in a secondary coil that's thousands of times greater than the initial voltage. Mm-hmm. So now, with that little Mr. Science explanation, I'm going to switch to Studio B.
Go for it.
Where I'm showing a giant Ruhmkorff coil. Now, get over here. I'll put these. The one I was just showing that you'll see later when you watch the show is my little, just a few inches long. And then this is a giant Ruhmkorff coil that I got from someone who picked it up in Prague for some reason. It actually has some Czech writing on it. It was all broken, and I had to put it back together. And I have it hooked to 2 6-volt lantern batteries that are going to feed it. And now it's going to make a big spark. So here's where we may lose our connection. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So that looked like that was about an inch. I can go to about 2 inches on here. And then what we have is between these 2 electrodes, there are these really cool purple sparks arcing. It's like a plasma. Okay, that's 2 inches. You can probably hear it.
Yeah. Kind of a fluttering noise.
I can separate those by as much as 4.5 inches and still get a spark off 12 volts. And since the dielectric breakdown voltage of the air is around 75,000 volts an inch, that means the coil produces 300,000 volts.
Jesus.
But the thing is, it's not horribly dangerous because, when you when you multiply the voltage thousands of times, you're cutting the amperage by the same factor, so you don't get something for nothing, and it makes it unlikely that you'd kill yourself with one, but you do have to be careful.
That's good, but although it might be good for ratings. But only temporarily.
Yeah, but we had to sign those. We had to sign some kind of waiver recently, so.
Right.
Yeah. So we wouldn't be able to collect for dying on camera for the good of Blogging Heads TV.
Well, I can't wait to see
this. So anyway, that was today's experiment, and maybe we'll do another one later down the line.
I can't wait to see it. I think this is going to be the highlight of Blogging Heads from now on.
Well, I don't know. We can call it garage band science.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is the best kind of science.
It is, and yeah. Well, what do you have planned for the future?
Not much, Thanksgiving. Are we going to talk on Thanksgiving or the day after Thanksgiving? I guess.
Yeah, I'll be around.
Yeah, so will I.
We'll play it by ear.
Yeah, I'll do something on the the physics of turkey basting or something.
Oh yeah, has somebody written the physics of Thanksgiving yet? I mean, they had the physics of Christmas.
Oh God, they must have. We'll find something.
Yeah. I mean, a turkey's such an artificial. I mean, talk about genetic engineering and creating monsters. The modern Thanksgiving turkey. So.
Somebody just told me that I forget where I had this conversation. Somebody just told me that there's a new book out about the quest for the biggest pumpkin on Earth. You heard of this? So
No.
The pumpkins now, people are growing pumpkins that are over 1,200 pounds. You need a forklift to lift them up. And it's this, I guess there's some kind of, I don't know, you get prizes or something. There's some sort of economic incentive for growing these damn things.
I wonder what the bioethicists think of that.
Yeah. Anyway, hey man, this has been fun.
John, it was fun. So we'll see you hopefully next week.
Okay, sounds good. Have a great Thanksgiving.
Same to you.